What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive on how wrong Dr. Jeremiah Johnston is about the Shroud of Turin. We will also be getting into the fact that Jesus' crucifixion is actually only theologically necessary and not historically necessary. So if you want to fuck around and find out how wrong Dr. Jeremiah Johnston is about the Shroud of Turin, then please stay tuned.
Perhaps no religious artifact on planet Earth creates as much fascination and controversy as the Shroud of Turin. Is this the real burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth? Well, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, an expert on the shroud, believes the evidence for it is now beyond all doubt. So, my friend, that is a huge statement. Why do you believe that?
Well, it's great to be with you, Raj, on CBN News. I believe that based on the evidence, 102 scientific disciplines have spent over 600,000 hours of scientific study on the Shroud of Turin. And the great majority of them have concluded the shroud is indeed 2,000 years old.
First off, simply just listing 102 disciplines that have studied the Shroud of Turin in a vague way tells us literally nothing. We don't know if any of these disciplines have any relevance to studying an artifact like the Shroud. It's a classic apologist tactic to vaguely reference the evidence and then just appeal to large numbers in order to convince their audience. They seem to think that this somehow implies a scientific rigor that most people expect for facts. I highly doubt his numbers here on multiple levels. I doubt the number of scientific disciplines that have analyzed this shroud, as well as whether or not any of these disciplines have any direct relationship to analyzing an artifact like the shroud. But I also doubt this monumental amount of time he claims has spent on studying the shroud. Really? 600,000 hours? I'm sorry, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, you can't just throw large numbers at us and expect us to eat it up. And before we get more into Johnston's video here, I do want to lay out exactly how much of an uphill battle he is fighting. We can only accurately date the shroud back to 1354 France. And even then, it was denounced by a local bishop as a forgery. We'll get more into that later. Now, if that wasn't problematic enough, the 1988 radiocarbon study that was done by 3 independent labs actually dated the shroud to between 1260 and 1390 CE, which matches up to when the shroud first entered the historical record. The majority of peer-reviewed studies on the Shroud of Turin suggest that it cannot be dated earlier than the late 13th century. But sure, let's say that the shroud actually is 2,000 years old. That doesn't mean that it's Jesus's burial shroud or that the image that's on the shroud was produced magically. But let's be real here, the shroud simply cannot be dated to the 1st century of the Common Era. But even if we could, it proves nothing about the death or even the resurrection of Jesus.
And based on my biblical scholarship, I can assure you that no one was crucified the way Jesus of Nazareth was crucified on April 3rd, AD 33. We know the exact date. It's the best established fact of the ancient world.
All right, brace yourselves, because I got a lot to say about this particular topic. Jesus' crucifixion was actually a theologically necessary event, and so not necessarily a historical event. That makes Dr. Johnston's statement that no one was crucified the way that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified verifiably bullshit. All right, let's break down the historical context surrounding crucifixions themselves, but also in the context of the theological nature of it. Now, the reason why Jesus is characterized as being crucified via the Roman version of crucifixion is because everyone characterized as Jesus was in the Gospels was crucified by the Romans in this way. On his blog discussing the crucifixion, Dr. Bart Ehrman notes this.
Crucifixion was reserved for special cases, but there were lots of special cases. 2 of the most common were low-life criminals and enemies of the state. It is what Romans did to insurrectionists and prospective insurrectionists, to anyone who opposed their power, by proposing to set up their own kingdom.
Now, let's consider that the Roman version of crucifixion that Jesus supposedly suffered under is only described in the Gospels. Using the Roman version of crucifixion makes a lot of sense to convey the message intended. The Gospels were written by people that attended pagan schools in order to learn how to read and write in Greek. Now, while these Gospels did have each of their own intended audiences, all of the Gospels' theology was centered on a character that opposed earthly powers and was preaching about this super kingdom that everybody is going to be a part of, overshadowing the need for these earthly powers and kingdoms. Your audience is going to expect your suffering and dying Messiah figure to be dealt with accordingly. So now that covers like why the Roman version of crucifixion was expected by the audience that the Gospels were being written to. But what do the actual sources say about Jesus's supposed crucifixion, like the real historical sources? Now, we don't have many of those. Actually, we have nearly none, but there is one person that we can appeal to in this situation. We go by the earliest reference, which would be in Paul's epistles. He only mentions the stauros. Now, this Greek word can be rendered as cross, but only because it means an upright stake or pole, often used for capital punishment. And Paul definitely knew that Jesus' atonement was a replacement for the Yom Kippur ritual. He demonstrates this understanding in Romans 3:25. And the community that's theologically close to Paul has Hebrews 9:12, which explicitly makes this connection. Now keep in mind that Galatians 1:14 has Paul proclaiming that he has advanced his knowledge in Judaism beyond all his peers. The Jewish scriptures and traditions that Paul is referencing here has already specified that the Messiah was to die and also how the Messiah was to die. Of course, I feel like most of my audience is going to understand that Paul and other Christians like him were reinterpreting Isaiah 53, the suffering servant passage, to be about the Messiah. And they were reading into this idea that the Messiah was to be killed. So that's kind of a no-brainer at this point. I do want to heavily emphasize that that's not the original intent of the suffering servant. The suffering servant is definitely Israel in the original context, but in the context that Paul is reading it, Isaiah 53 is talking about the suffering and death of the Messiah. So that's what Paul thinks it's about. Regardless of whether or not Paul is correct in this interpretation, that's how he interpreted it. Most of the time, people don't really understand that the Old Testament has already actually laid out the specifications for how the Messiah should die. Deuteronomy 21:22-23 says,
"When someone is convicted of a crime punishable by death and is executed, and you hang them on a tree, his corpse must not remain all night upon the tree. You must bury him that same day, for anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you for possession."
Jesus was cursed with the sins of mankind, well, technically Israel, and this mimics something that's found in the Yom Kippur ritual, where you have the scapegoat that it has the sins of Israel placed upon it and then sent out into the wilderness. Lucky for us, Paul mentions this exact verse in Galatians 3:13.
"Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree.'"
So Paul, having advanced his understanding of the Jewish scriptures and traditions to the point where he was, easily made this connection. So at least for our only historical reference to the supposed crucifixion or the cross of Jesus, it seems like Paul only thought of it as a stake. And this stake, or this crucifixion, this cross, was theologically necessary because of what is said in the Old Testament about him bearing the sins of everybody and being cursed. So, our earliest record of this cross or crucifixion coming from Paul has him understanding this cross as just an upright stake or pole that's used for capital punishment. And the reason why it is a stake or pole or cross, stauros, is because of what the Old Testament says about anybody that is hung on a tree, considering the theology of Christianity being that Jesus is a replacement for the atonement ritual, where the sins of Israel are placed on this goat that is then sent out into the wilderness. The unique thing that's done here by Christians is that they've merged the two goats in the Yom Kippur ritual into one goat that both is sacrificed and also has the sins of Israel laid upon it. That is how one person can fulfill magically the Yom Kippur ritual and cleanse the sins of everybody. That's how Paul understood it, and so there's no way that anybody can say that Paul knew of a crucifixion, so therefore Jesus had to have been crucified. He only knew of an upright stake that apparently Jesus got pinned to. And all of this was only theologically necessary, not historically necessary. If there was a Jesus that did exist in the first century, and that Jesus just so happened to be crucified by the Romans, then we literally have no idea how it happened, when it happened, or where it happened. The April 3rd, 33 AD date is pure speculation based on bullshit evidence. And now that I'm actually saying the date out loud, it sounds like a very divine number in the first place. April 3rd, 33 AD. Are you saying 3 threes? Can you get any more cliche about it? Can I be any more of a cliche? Also, saying that it is the best attested fact in the ancient world is pure apologetic bullshit. Oh, give me that good old apologetics.
And so based on this scientific evidence, and many of it is breaking news for your audience, such as the fact that the Institute of Crystallography in Italy has confirmed using wide-angle X-ray scattering technology that the Shroud of Turin, which again is currently in Italy, but is indeed 2,000 years old. We believe it to be the very burial cloths of Jesus of Nazareth.
All right. This is going to be kind of a scientifically intense section here, so bear with me, okay? First, we have to ask what the Waxis method is, and why is it even being used here? Waxis, or wide-angle X-ray scattering, bombards materials with X-rays to study the structural degradation of cellulose. In this case, it would be linen fibers. The idea is that over time, the molecular structure is going to degrade in a predictable way, and this lets scientists estimate the age of the material. Now, the next question is, why is this even being used on the shroud? Using the Waxis method on the shroud presents a number of issues. The method itself is going to require whatever material you're studying to be housed in a climate-controlled area. The method itself is going to require stable storage conditions in order to render an accurate date. Since the technique estimates age based on structural degradation, this should be the first red flag whenever you hear about a Waxis study being done on the Shroud of Turin, unless you're a deeply biased person that really wants the resurrection to be a real historical event. Then you're just not even going to worry about, critical thinking. The entire argument that apologists use for the image on the Shroud of Turin is that some kind of magical light bombarded the shroud, and that light emanated from the dead body of Jesus. And I say magical because this kind of electromagnetic radiation must have not worked exactly like all other electromagnetic radiation out there. First, it supposedly came from a dead body. And second, it would have had to have not affected the structural integrity of the shroud itself. X-rays are part of the electromagnetic spectrum of light. So they have to start this study by assuming that the light that was emanating from Jesus's body was a magical form of light that doesn't operate like any other form of light that we have ever known to exist. In other words, what they're saying is, well, this method works as long as the resurrection, didn't do anything unique to the laws of physics. If it did, then just ignore the science on it. It's basically special pleading wrapped up in scientific jargon. The study's conclusions also had a number of issues themselves. First of all, it doesn't even get the dating correct. First, the Waxis dates the shroud to around 55 to 74 CE, which is at least 22 years past the time when Jesus supposedly died. But in their conclusion, the researchers said that the structural degradation of the shroud matches a 2,000-year-old time frame. So not strictly the 55 to 74 CE dating that they get from the Waxis method, meaning that they did the actual study, looked at the findings, and was like, yeah, that's close enough. But these scientists are basically adding on speculation to into the Waxus results in order to get an earlier date. I don't know about y'all, but I feel like that is yet another red flag, and also not how science is done. If we compare this to the 1988 radiocarbon study, all three of the independent labs dated to the same time frame, which was the time frame that corroborated the actual documented history of the shroud. Do you notice the big difference in quality here? Nobody has to add speculation onto the 1988 study, but you got to add speculation and ad hoc conclusions onto this whole Waxus study. But anyways, the math isn't mathing on this particular conclusion here. The study was conducted in 2022, and if the linen is 2,000 years old, that would place it about 11 years before Jesus was supposedly crucified, at least the date that Dr. Jeremiah Johnston gives. But I do feel like this entire conversation is rendered moot when you consider the fact that the Waxus study automatically assumes that the shroud was stored between 20 and 22.5 degrees Celsius for 13 fucking centuries that we have no historical data about. That's how they get their 2,000 year estimate. Oh, and not just the temperature, but also the humidity. Humidity had to remain between 55 and 75%. Now, the actual medieval storage conditions, which would have been in a cooler and drier climate, would render this timeline invalid. If the recorded conditions that we have invalidate the timeline, then that makes this entire endeavor pointless. There's no way to know how old the shroud is using wide-angle X-ray scattering. Now, here's something that we do know about the shroud that plays into the 1988 radiocarbon dating and the historical record for the Shroud of Turin, and that's the herringbone weave. It's a 3-to-1 twill weave, and this is the weave that is found in the Shroud of Turin. What's interesting about this is that this particular weave is absent from the historical record of first century Jewish shrouds that were used in burials. They typically employed simpler plain weaves. The Hungarian Prey manuscript, which is generally dated between 1180 and 1190 CE, also uses the herringbone weave. This suggests medieval origins for the Shroud of Turin. Now, the 1988 radiocarbon dating study that was done on the Shroud of Turin included 3 independent labs from Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, and they confirmed the medieval date between 1260 and 1390 CE. This radiocarbon study is one of the most widely cited studies concerning the shroud. So, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston is laying out a whole bunch of apologetic bullshit right here up front, discussing, number 1, the crucifixion of Jesus, and then 2, how verifiable the results of this Waxus study actually are. Seems like Dr. Jeremiah Johnston is just an educated apologist. They like to go by theologian or New Testament scholar, but they're just educated apologists.
Keep in mind for your audience, and I know your audience is full of Christian thinkers, all 4 Gospels mention the fact that Joseph of Arimathea wrapped Jesus's body in a linen burial shroud. The Greek word is sindon, anathonia, and then sudarium. And so we believe based on the evidence.
The fact that the authors of the Gospels were able to get general Jewish burial practices correct just means that they knew about the Jewish burial practices enough to bullshit a story about Jesus's burial. Our earliest record of this Jesus comes from the Apostle Paul, and Paul never mentions a burial shroud whatsoever. He barely even mentions a burial. In 1 Corinthians 15, he mentions that Jesus or Christ was buried, but that's about it. Joseph of Arimathea was most likely an invented character that was only necessary for the burial of Jesus. The name itself seems to be made up. It uses the very generic Joseph that was very common at that time. It's also integral to Jesus's surrogate father while he was here on earth in the story. His last name seems to be a combination of prefix, root word, and suffix that ends up meaning best doctrine town. Dr. Carrier does a great job of explaining how we should be very skeptical about the name Joseph of Arimathea.
Arimathea is probably an invented word, meaning best doctrine town. Ara being a standard Greek prefix for best, math being the root of teaching, doctrine, and disciple, and ea being a standard suffix of place. No such town is known to have existed.
Additionally, Dennis MacDonald, a New Testament scholar, has connected the Gospels to the works of Homer. He believes that Priam in the Iliad is the inspiration for the character Joseph of Arimathea. In the Iliad, Priam seeks out the body of his son Hector, and Joseph of Arimathea does the exact same thing for Jesus' body in the Gospel of Matthew. The name Joseph could also be a callback to a character in the Exodus story also named Joseph. Joseph in Exodus asks Pharaoh to have Jacob's body so that he can bury him in a tomb, just as Joseph of Arimathea does for Jesus' body. So, all in all, there are multiple ways that Joseph of Arimathea could have been invented, whether that was purely inventing the Arimathea part or using various figures from both pagan sources as well as Jewish sources in order to come up with this story of Joseph of Arimathea. It seems like this person never really was a person.
Not based on failing, not based on some kind of vibe, but based on the evidence that we do indeed have a 2,000-year-old burial shroud. Now, why do we believe it's Jesus? Raj, unlike other burial shrouds, and we have many of them that we have discovered from the land of Israel. Think about Lazarus. He's buried in a burial shroud in John chapter 11 when Jesus raises him from the dead. The unique thing about the Shroud of Turin, which is fascinating, is there is an image that is superficially embedded in the 14-foot long burial cloth of the front and back of a 5'11" man, Jewish man with a beard who has experienced trauma that matches and corresponds with all of the details of Jesus's death by Roman crucifixion. And that's why we believe it is indeed the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth.
All right, so this claim again is scientifically intensive, so you need to hang on for a second. First of all, the logic here doesn't really make a lot of sense, but he also makes a number of historical errors. First, let's start off by assuming that this actually is an image of a 5'11" Jewish bro that was crucified by the Romans. How does Jeremiah Johnston know that this image is of the image of the Jesus that supposedly started Christianity? It could literally be any other Jewish figure that was crucified by the Romans that looks vaguely similar to how we normally depict Jesus now. There's no real way to know, but Dr. Jeremiah Johnston definitely wants to represent a possible explanation as a plausible explanation. However, there are several reasons why you would not want to consider this to be the image of a first century Jewish man. First of all, the bloodstain patterns are unrealistic. Forensic studies done on the shroud have shown that there are inconsistencies with the blood flow, and the side wounds appear to be artistically placed rather than gravity driven, suggesting that they were painted or applied post-mortem. The lack of smearing or disturbance of blood clots, despite the fact that the body had been removed from the shroud, contradicts natural wound mechanics, implying that the stains were intentionally created. Next, the shroud's depiction of a bearded, long-haired man with a middle part is more indicative of medieval European iconography rather than first-century Jewish burial practices. The image's resemblance to Byzantine-era artistic representations of Jesus dating back to 550 CE suggests that it was modeled after existing religious art, rather than an actual corpse. While proponents of the shroud's authenticity argue that it accurately shows crucifixion wounds, critics will note that medieval artists could have recreated those wounds with the contemporary medical knowledge they had, or they could have just used the depictions of Roman crucifixions. Additionally, the 5'11" height seems to exceed the general height of a first century Jewish man, which was around 5'5". So that also raises questions about the historical plausibility of the Shroud of Turin. The shroud's negative image, resembling a photographic negative, was not understood scientifically until the 19th century. However, researchers have replicated similar effects using medieval techniques, such as bas relief rubbing with acidic pigments. All these factors seem to line up perfectly with its first appearance in 1354 Lorraine, France. And again, no historical records linking it to earlier periods. Even contemporary bishops, when it was first introduced in France, were calling it a forgery. They even cited the involvement of local artists. In 1389, Bishop d'Arcis wrote a detailed memorandum to Pope Clement VII, claiming that the image on the shroud was actually the invention of a local artist and not a miraculous imprint. He stated that an artist confessed to creating the image and accused the canons of the Church of Lorraine of perpetrating a fraud for financial gain. Even Bishop d'Arcis's predecessor, Bishop Bishop Henry de Poitiers had reservations about the shroud. So it seems like even when the shroud first appeared in Loire, France, people were already doubting it. And there are even claims of an artist confessing to creating the shroud. So why do we invest 600,000 hours of research into something that was claimed initially to be an artist rendition? Seems pretty fucking dumb to me, but you know, I'm just a hick from North Alabama.
Oh my gosh, that is so exciting. Can you give us a little bit of the details on the image itself? Like, how did that come to be?
This is what's fascinating to scientists, and this is what's fun for your audience. I know the 2 million subscribers of CBN News love to see ways that faith and reason intersect. And in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, which of course is attested to in the New Testament, we have this artifact, the Shroud of Turin, where you have the death, burial, and resurrection all found in one artifact from history. This is fantastic. And Aeneas Laboratories in Rome, Paul Delazzo spent 5 years of his scientific life studying how much light energy would be required to leave a flash, if you will, a first century selfie, if you will, of Jesus of Nazareth in the Shroud of Turin. And again, this isn't a pastor trying to prove anything. This is a light scientist. And Paul Delazzo states it took 34,000 trillion watts of energy, but
Whoa.
It wasn't just the amount of energy, it was the speed. Think about when the Bible says we'll see Jesus in the twinkling of an eye. The Aeneas Laboratories said this 34,000 trillion watts of energy traveled in 1/40th of a billionth of a second to leave the image on the shroud. Otherwise, it would have scorched the image and destroyed it.
First of all, the speed that he's referring to here is not the speed of photons. It's actually the duration of the flash. Next, a light scientist would just be a fucking physicist. Physicists study light, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. See, this is what happens when idiot apologists try to explain scientific studies. They come up with bullshit titles like light scientist. Despite the large amount of energy he claims was released, the claim itself is grounded in magical thinking. First of all, how did a dead body generate light? Magic. Why did the 8.5 million joules of energy, which is equivalent to about 2 kilograms of TNT exploding, only slightly singed linen that was right next to it? Obviously, the answer is magic, right? These are essential questions that we must ask with this kind of claim, but they don't have good answers for it. All they have is magic or God did it! Keep in mind that linen auto-ignites at around 200 degrees Celsius. But even a fraction of this energy would just vaporize that shroud. Studies using UV lasers in order to replicate the image of the shroud on a piece of linen required controlled, localized pulses of 34 trillion watts, not the petawatts that he was mentioning. And they did this to avoid combustion. Apparently, Jesus was magical enough to, generate this light in a way that didn't require several pulses in order to, singe that image onto the shroud.
Wasn't that special?
The energy that Dr. Jeremiah Johnston is discussing in this section would ionize the linen cellulose, breaking those molecular bonds, and leave a charring or plasma residue. This is very much unlike the shroud's superficial and unburned image. Now, let's just say that there was an energy release when Jesus resurrected, and that this is the amount of energy that Dr. Johnston claims was released, was actually released. What would happen? That would have some significant effects in the immediate area, right? It definitely would. The energy that Dr. Johnston claims was released would have created a pressure wave powerful enough to shatter nearby structures and ignite fires within a 10-meter radius. For you Americans out there, that's 10 washers or 42 dicks. I'm sorry, I don't know how many bicycles. Honey, what else do we measure with? A yardstick. Actual measuring instruments. These intense UV and X rays would have ionized the air. They would would have literally formed plasma and caused secondary burns. And all of this would have been really problematic for the surrounding area, including the supposed Roman soldiers that were positioned directly outside of the tomb. At least that's what Matthew claims. That's the only gospel that claims that, but if there were Roman soldiers outside of the tomb, they definitely would have been fucking vaporized. Of course, it won't surprise you to know that there are no records whatsoever in the first century in Judea of an event like this happening, or even in medieval Europe, which is where the shroud was stored. Now, despite what Dr. Jeremiah Johnston said in this particular section, I think that he probably just misspoke, because the actual study didn't use the petawatts that he was talking about, but did use 34 billion watt UV lasers. They required precise laboratory conditions and involved changing it from a single large blast to multiple successive pulses. This is entirely different from either what Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, the supposed expert here, is going to tell you, or what is even possible in reality.
And the image is just 2 or 3 microns thin. It disappears if you go closer than 8 feet to the shroud. And so this is what has baffled scientists. Scientists have confirmed it is not a work of art. It's not man-made. No one's worshiping some kind of man-made idol or relic here. They have confirmed there's no pigment, there's no dye.
All right, heathens, this is another very scientifically intense section, so please bear with me, okay? In 1978, microscopist Walter McCrone identified red ochre, iron oxide, and vermilion, mercury sulfide, on the shroud using polarized light microscopy. He argued that these pigments, mixed with a collagen tempera medium, could have been applied using a 14th century grisaille technique. That's a monochromatic painting method. Of course, after McCrone's conclusions, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, disputed his conclusions, stating that their tests, pyrolysis mass spectrometry, found no evidence of pigments at all. However, McCrone countered STURP's response by pointing out that their instruments lacked the precision necessary to detect these pigments. McCrone then suggested that these pigments could have worn off in the centuries following the shroud's creation. This would have been rubbed off through handling and exposure. That would have only left faint traces on the shroud that could only be detected through advanced microscopy. This aligns with the shroud's 0.2 micron image layer. In 2009, Luigi Gurichelli replicated the shroud's image using red ochre on linen, then artificially aging it through heating and washing. This process produced a similar halftone effect, illustrating how pigments can degrade over time to near invisibility, while Sturp attributed traces of iron oxide to natural flax processing. McCrone argued that its purity and distribution indicated intentional application. Medieval artists frequently used iron oxide as a pigment, making the hypothesis that an artist generated the shroud. Supporting this hypothesis are the artistic methods being suggested. Researchers have recreated shroud-like images by rubbing linen on a bas-relief sculpture using acidic pigments. This method avoids deep penetration into the fibers, aligning with the shroud's superficial image. Additionally, McCrone compared the shroud's image to 14th century grisaille paintings, which employed thin, transparent layers of pigment, consistent with the shroud's faint, non-penetrative coloration. The fact that medieval artists used vermilion to simulate blood further adds credibility to this hypothesis. Essentially, the claim that, oh, there's no pigment or dye, therefore some dead Jewish guy resurrected and magically transformed into a single burst of UV radiation before he ascended to another plane of existence to become this magical highmost god. A ridiculously unsupported conclusion.
But they have also said we have no idea how this happened. The best rocket scientists of our day, Raj, cannot explain how the image is embedded in the linen cloth. They can't duplicate it.
Oh my gosh, that's so exciting.
That's because rocket scientists do rocket science, not advanced microscopy or specialists in medieval artistic techniques. However, actual experts in these fields have provided plausible explanations for how a medieval artist could have produced this image, which we find in its current state today. Not to mention the fact that when it was first introduced in 1354, it had an artist claiming that he rendered the image on the shroud. I mean, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston is just simply dead fucking wrong here.
Now, I know for a lot of folks, especially, let's just call it a Western American Christian perspective, and myself included, there's this immediate pushback. Was like, oh, this feels like the Holy Grail. This feels Indiana Jonesy. But I've talked with you, obviously, over the years, and the more that the evidence comes out, it's like, guys, this might be legit, and I know you believe it 100%.
Yeah, I mean, Indiana Jones incorporates magical elements to their storylines all throughout the series. I mean, the first film included a magical Ark of the Covenant. The second had magical stones. The third showcased a magical cup. The fourth introduced aliens for some fucking reason. And spoiler alert, the final installment presented a magical time machine. If this entire storyline that Dr. Jeremiah Johnston is providing through the Shroud of Turin as evidence for Jesus' resurrection, if that sounds like a subpar Indiana Jones film, it's because it is one. It's not history. It's a blend of science and historical fiction.
But here's the most important question. What if it is the Shroud? Then what does that mean?
Well, there's a couple of things I want to remind your audience of, and thanks for having me. Number one, we wouldn't have a New Testament if there wasn't evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Remember, no one expected Jesus to rise from the dead, and they're shocked when they see him. And remember Thomas in John 20, unless I see the nail prints in the wrists, unless I see the wound in the side, I will not believe.
Well, it would be incorrect to say that there weren't any Jews expecting a dying and rising Messiah. Dr. Daniel Boyarin, a world-renowned Jewish Talmud scholar, illuminates this in his book, The Jewish Gospels, the story of the Jewish Christ. He points out that there definitely were groups, pre-Christian groups of Jews that were expecting a dying and rising Messiah.
The suffering Messiah who atones for our sins was a familiar idea throughout the history of the Jewish religion, even long after there truly was a separation from Christianity. The idea of a suffering Messiah is present in ancient, medieval, and early modern Judaism. This fact, at the very least, calls into question the truism that the formation and acceptance of this idea by followers of Jesus constituted the necessary and absolute breaking point with the religion of Israel. The suffering Messiah is part and parcel of Jewish tradition from antiquity to modernity. Not only, then, is the gospel drawing on Jewish tradition, but this idea remained a Jewish one long after Christianity had indeed been separated off in late antiquity. Daniel Boyarin, The Jewish Gospels, The Story of the Jewish Christ, pages 82 and 83.
Additionally, scholar Martin Hangel also supports this conclusion. Dr. Jason Staples has also identified some of these same Jewish groups, independently of Dr. Daniel Boyarin, that developed a dying and rising Messiah theology. This was in response to the death of King Onias III. Dr. Jason Staples says,
"The oft-repeated dictum that there is no evidence for the concept of a suffering and dying anointed one, or of a messianic interpretation of the suffering servant in pre-Christian Judaism is therefore mistaken." Jason A. Staples, The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, page 180, Cambridge University Press.
To establish this, Staples cites 4 other scholars: Brownlee, Goldingay, Ginsburg, and Portier-Young. And not to beat a dead horse or anything, but scholars Israel Knoll, Michael Wise support the notion of a pre-Christian dying and rising Messiah theology. So the Jewish people would have been easily accepting as well as expecting a dying and rising Messiah, primarily because they had already developed that theology before the 1st century CE.
And what's awesome about Jesus, he meets us in our doubts. He doesn't shame us. He sharpens us when we doubt. And so let's not be overly pious. I say this in love to many of my Christian brothers and sisters who are watching and go, oh, I have faith. I don't need evidence. I don't need artifacts. I don't need archaeology. I don't need Indiana Jones Christianity. Well, the original authors of the New Testament did. They needed evidence to see that he was alive from the dead before they authored the 8 or 9 authors of the New Testament.
Eyewitnesses authored nothing in the New Testament. I'm sorry to burst your bubble. Those that saw Jesus after his supposed death were more than likely hallucinate. And Paul wasn't an eyewitness to Jesus, but he did receive visions or hallucinations of a resurrected Jesus. These visions are definitely not representative of reality. And the same goes for all the other apostles. They received visions of Jesus exactly the way that Paul describes his visions of Jesus. And these visions could have been fueled by a multitude of different factors, like mental illnesses, extreme physical or emotional stress, or they could have just been bullshitting everybody. We don't know. I mean, if you're good with believing in whatever somebody is hallucinating, feel free, I guess. But for me, and a good portion of my audience here, I feel like we require actual evidence in order to believe in things. We need that evidence to comport with reality.
What Jesus did. Remember, John said, I've written all these so that you believe, so that you believe. In 1 John 1, he said, that which we have heard, which we have seen, which our hands have handled. I mean, this is evidence. And we're not talking about myths or fairy tales or fables. We're talking about real people, real places, real events. And so the implications are we have the moment of resurrection captured in a 1st century burial cloth.
Oh my God, an eyewitness did not write 1 John. Believing that 1 John is an eyewitness account is an apologetic used to convince gullible people. And if you've made it this far into the video, I don't think that you're a gullible person.
And what's so unique about this, Raj, it's tied to technology. I really believe as we get closer to the second coming of Jesus Christ, we are seeing this phenomena of a controlled revelation of Jesus Christ tied to technology.
Oh my God, this statement's so fucking vague. You could literally connect anything to a revelation of Jesus' second coming. This is just apocalyptic nonsense that has Miss Cleo turning around in her grave. All right, heathens, well, that's going to be it for me today. I appreciate you joining me for this extra long video. So I think this is probably the longest pre-recorded video response that I've actually done. So do you think that Dr. Jeremiah Johnston actually argued for the Shroud of Turin sufficiently? Do you think that he's correct about the shroud and that Jesus actually resurrected? Or do you agree with the evidence presented in this video that shows that it cannot be dated prior to the 14th century, and the earliest that you could possibly get it is the 13th century, the late 13th century? Let me know what you think down below. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.